Cool. Well, let's get started. Hello, everyone. It's so good to see you here. I want to thank you for being here today and um, getting to look through this liturgy. I've been looking forward to this webinar for a long time. Since we have a number of visitors, I thought I'd just give a brief explanation. My name is Mario Buchanan. I am the chair of the Lay Professional Advocacy Committee for the Association of Anglican Musicians. For those who don't know, the Association of Anglican Musicians is a member-led nonprofit organization for musicians and clergy serving in the Episcopal Church. We have over 1,000 members, which are made up of professional church musicians, priests, and bishops. And our great whiz at the keys here, Patrick, is going to put the link for our webpage in the chat for all of you to look if you'd be interested in joining us. We always welcome new members with open arms, so I hope that you check out our website. A couple of housekeeping things, friends, is as we go through the webinar, I ask you to please use the Q&A function in the bottom of Zoom. If you have a question anytime during the webinar, feel free to put it in there. Don't feel like you have to wait until the end when we do questions, and we will go through them. We won't use the chat feature for that, so just use the Q&A function and we'll get to questions. Well, I'm so excited for this panel. I was telling people, as excited as you can get for Good Friday. But thank you all to our panelists for being here. So I'd like to just start us off with Dan, who was the author of the liturgy. We will also, I should say as well to everyone, we will have the liturgy shared in the screen for us to go through. But Dan, how did this new liturgy come about, and what was the rationale behind creating it?
Right. Well, thank you, Mario, for having me here. I really appreciate hosting this and the LPAM as well. Good to be with friends. I'm a scholar of Jewish-Christian relations. As you probably saw in my bio, I now teach at Boston College's Center for Christian Jewish Learning. Before that, I taught at Episcopal Church seminaries for a number of years, first at Church Divinity School of the Pacific, and then at Seminary Southwest, Berkeley, and in Austin, Texas. For a long time, the Good Friday liturgy has left me and often other people I talk to unsettled. Whether it's the lengthy passion reading from the Gospel of John that we'll talk about, that has this repeated reference to the Jews as the main protagonists, or just other ways in which the prayers, the psalm collects can be presented, and the question of who's included, who's present, who's not present in this liturgy. Uh, there's a long history of Good Friday of being a time where animus against the Jewish people is especially stirred up. And so for years, I really wrestled with just my feelings about the Good Friday liturgy. And then as I moved, as is not uncommon with seminary professors, I got ordained while teaching at seminary. And as I moved into my priestly vocation, this became even more of a pressing issue for me. One of the classes I teach that I taught in various iterations, both in Berkeley and in Austin, was really a class on how should the church think about its relationship to Judaism and how should it look at various practices. So we workshopped various topics. One of the times I taught in Austin was in the fall of 2018 or spring of 2019. And I co-taught with a colleague, Rabbi Neil Blumhoff, who's a rabbi in Austin. And when we got to the Holy Week unit and Good Friday, my friend Neil said, "This liturgy really hurts. Why can't you just change it?" And for an Episcopalian to be asked, why can't you just change your liturgy is sort of like, why can't you move this mountain? And so I sort of stumbled over that. But then I realized that past summer at the 2018 General Convention, a process of prayer book revision, or imagining the invitation for people to begin imagining new sorts of liturgies to offer the church arose. And so I realized we were at a moment where we could maybe address some of these issues. So I went to my bishop, Bishop Andy Doyle, who was one of the key movers actually of some of those resolutions around revision, and asked permission to begin working on this. And so he granted that permission, and I worked with a team at St. David's Episcopal Church in downtown Austin. I'm sure many of you have maybe had a chance to visit there. I want to be clear, even though I'm sort of known as the author of it, I've always worked with others around this process. I especially want to highlight the role of the Reverend Chuck Treadwell, the rector of St. David's, in thinking this through. And so we had go through a couple of iterations of revision, and then it was passed at the 24 General Convention as an alternate liturgy that can be used with bishops' permission. I think we'll get into use and implement this later. But that's sort of a beginning answer for you, Mario.
Thanks, Dan. My next question is for Dan and Richard. Richard brought was the deputy who brought this liturgy to General Convention. So where do you, as you said, Dan, about starting a liturgy, where do you start with a new liturgy? How
Right.
much of the existing liturgy do you reference back to if you're unhappy with it?
Yeah, and so this is one of the things I began pondering about how you even go about this process is there's so much power and beauty in the Good Friday liturgy. And so there was a sense that there was a lot that was worthwhile with the structure and what the liturgy is trying to do. So the intention was always to do what we might call a conservative revision of the liturgy, and to always underscore the point that the goal here was not to replace the 1979 prayer book liturgy, but to provide an alternate rite that for people for whom some of the issues that we were addressing in the liturgy seemed important and appropriate, that they could avail themselves of it. So the goal was always to keep the framework of the existing liturgy and simply work on a couple of key elements. And I'm happy to sort of walk us through that with Richard a little bit, some of these elements.
Um, so maybe Patrick can share the liturgy up.
Yeah, here
Lovely.
we go. Good. Right. So we're here on page 7. And so this uses the opening collect is the same as the opening collect that you find in the traditional liturgy. The first real change is with the epistle. Um, Often what's used for the epistle in the Seminary prayer book is a reading from I'm sorry, from Hebrews, that really imagines the death of Christ as replacing the temple sacrifices. So the real point of emphasis is on sacrifice for this day, and a sense that the what was done in the temple in Jerusalem somehow wasn't fitting enough or didn't do enough. For me, as a theologian of Jewish Christian relations, this raises the question of why would God in the Hebrew Bible command sacrifices and ask for a temple to be built if the temple itself wasn't enough? And so rather than saying this is not a good reading, or to say, Hebrew shouldn't be read, to provide two alternatives. So one is to provide this reading from Ephesians, which provides a different narration of the work of salvation, which focuses less on a sacrificial death of Christ, but rather his death as a way of bringing about reconciliation between people. So it's still talking about the death of Christ, but focusing on the work of reconciliation versus work of sacrifice. The second Hebrews reading is kept as the same from the original prayer book rite as well. Then what we get to is the reading of the Passion Gospel, and this occurs on page 8. Um, And here you'll note that um, the rubric below discusses that the congregation taking that care to explain the meaning of the term the Jews in the Passion Gospels, the duty of the leaders of the service. And the notes at the end of the liturgy include suggested translations of the Passion Gospel. So this is one of the key neuralgic points of Good Friday is this Passion reading. And Richard was quite involved with shaping this piece of how the final form of the liturgy landed. Do you want to say anything about this piece, Richard?
Yeah. Thank you, Dan. And thank you everybody for being here. This is this has been a very hotly debated topic. When Dan and I first started working on this together, which was you brought me in about 5 years ago, I think, in 2020. The proposal was that basically you could use the NRSV, and in the NRSV, in John, John uses the words "hoi aiuadoi" um, frequently, which is translated to mean the Jews. But it can be also be translated or read as the Judeans, which is how both Dan and I like to translate it. Dan's opinion matters more because he actually knows this. I just kind of agree with him. But doing just replacing that, doing an emendation of the NRSV text runs afoul of copyright. So instead, Dan and I basically propose a few options to General Convention last year, and in their wisdom, what they chose to, and I will have Patrick send the link out to everyone, comes from you have options. You can use the Common English Bible, I believe, which we've authorized, that has alternatives for the Jews in it. We've also approved in the notes to the liturgy this resource from Gail Ramshaw, who's a Lutheran liturgical scholar, and it's an amended version of John's Passion that's published for free by Augsburg Fortress and the ELCA.
And those notes appear in the section of the alternate right title concerning the service, I believe in the bottom of the first and top of the second page that kind of explain the options. Um, Again, just to note, one way of actually avoiding saying the Jews over and over again is you'll see that the option is you can either read John 18 to 1 through 1942, which is the longer version, but you could also do an option of just reading John chapter 19, verses 1 through 42. If you just do chapter 19, you actually avoid many of the problematic phrases and elements. I believe, Richard, we also have chant about this, and you're going to address that later on, I think.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, that'll be discussed in a bit.
Yeah, great. Um, the other major piece, the Solemn Collects. The Solemn Collects are introduced into our prayer book tradition in 1979. Prior to that, we only had a single collect on Good Friday. If you're familiar with the prayer book tradition, you might recall that the 1662 Book of Common Prayer for Good Friday had a prayer concerning the conversion of Jews, pagans, heretics, and Turks. So Jews, Christian heretics, non-Christians, and Muslims. Uh, um, or and there was a sense of the Jew stood in the first of that those four terms. So the Jewish person was conceptualized in the 1662 collect on Good Friday as kind of paradigmatic of unbelief on Good Friday, and that the problem of Jewish unbelief was something that had to be prayed about. That collect is retained in the 1789 Episcopal Book of Common Prayer. It is uh, altered in 1928, and by the time we get to the 1979 Psalm Collects, there is a prayer about people who lack belief or don't have faith yet in Christ. But if you recognize the history of the prayers, the figure of Jewish unbelief still lurks there somewhere in the background. You might be aware that the Roman Catholic Church had also a prayer about the conversion of what they called the perfidious Jew that was removed in the 1958 liturgical revision process. So the good news about the 79 BCP Psalm Collects is it didn't have any negative language about Jews. What had happened in most other Christian bodies between 1979 and the early 21st century is Catholics, Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, for their Good Friday service, had some sort of prayer that affirmed God's relationship with the Jewish people, affirmed their covenant, and also had some kind of lament or repentance of harm that the church had done towards the Jewish people. So what we have, and if we could scroll to, I think it's page 10. Oh no, I'm sorry. You actually have this here on the top of. Nope. Go back to page 10. Thank you. So you'll see towards the top of page 10. I think this is the third set of Psalm Collects. I worked on composing this Psalm Collect that's doing both of these things. The majority of Western Christianity has come to affirm that the Jewish people are in an ongoing covenant with God, and have also come to state that it's important for churches to repent of their historic harm to the Jewish people and to engage in an ongoing corporate amendment of life to ensure that doesn't happen again within the Christian church. So I'm just going to read to you what I composed with others for this new Psalm Collect and say a little bit more about this. So let us pray for the Jewish people who, by the grace of their eternal covenant with God, were delivered from bondage into freedom, for their continued faithfulness, for their flourishing and peace as witnesses to God's sustaining love, for their safety from all malice and harm, for their liberation from all forms of anti-Semitism and hatred, for the fullness of redemption for the sake of God's name, that unity and concord may exist between Jews and Christians in obedience to God's will. And as is typical for some collect, there's a silence, and then there's the concluding prayer. O God of Abraham, and I'll say something about the brackets in a minute. You planted your people Israel as their root and grafted all people as wild branches into a single olive tree of praise to you. As we come near to the cross, we lament Christian acts of prejudice and violence against your faithful people, of whom Jesus Christ was born. Bless the children of your covenant, so that together we may attain the fullness of your blessing for the world. So what you see happening here is affirmation of covenantal relationship, affirming the Jewishness of Jesus, which is important on this day of Good Friday, in which historically hostility towards Jews has been stirred up, and acknowledging the need for some kind of amendment of life. It attempts to use a lot of biblical metaphor as well. The General Convention Prayer Book Committee chose to add Sarah and Hagar in brackets as optional use, as has been increasingly common when patriarchs are involved, to also invoke matriarchs. Originally, it was just Abraham, because in Jewish Christian relations, an emphasis on the Abrahamic covenant is a key symbolic point. Is there anything else you want to say here, Richard?
No, I was going to bring that up if you didn't.
Okay.
That's also.
Yeah, and they're seeking feedback around the inclusion in the brackets there for the next go around.
Yeah.
I think they're seeking feedback for the whole liturgy.
Yes. I mean, I would add that with Hagar throws in an additional wrench in the interreligious dialogue of politic that comes from this liturgy, because Hagar is traditionally seen as the mother of the Islamic faith. for
Yeah.
whom we share the Abrahamic root, which is great. And I think both in my conversations with the Jewish leaders in my life have been like, what is going on here? That's y'all are weird for this. And so I would just point that out as well, that with that, you get a whole nother set of problems.
Yeah, it introduces another set of associations, and it's worth having an ongoing conversation about that. Yeah. So really, the rest of the liturgy is more or less the same. So we've really highlighted the three kind of major elements here: a shift in the epistle reading, changing sensibilities towards the gospel reading, and this new solemn collect. So thank you. Mario, back to you.
Thank you both. So going into, how this works in the parish. So Kate, you have done this in your parish, and I'm wondering, what was the journey like? How did people respond to it?
Well, for us, it was a fairly easy thing to do because we're blessed to have Dan as a priest associate at our parish. So he was right there on site to guide us through. Um, but also, as we've all been alluding to, the traditional solemn collects have bothered me and a lot of others for some time, and also among the members of our congregation. We do have several members of our parish who are married to someone who's Jewish, and the phrasing in the prayer book just didn't really sit right with anyone. So when Dan made me aware of this liturgy, we emailed our bishop for permission to use it, and he was very happy to do that. He was actually pleased that we were going to use it. And our new bishop is supportive of it as well. We just changed bishops this year. In terms of the congregation, we didn't do a lot of formation or education around it beforehand. We did make a few announcements on the Sundays leading up that this was going to happen. But the main thing was, again, we were lucky to have Dan around, was to ask Dan to preach on that Good Friday so that he could sort of unpack it for people in his sermon. But honestly, the changes are well, they're not subtle to anyone who's a liturgist, but to many of the people in our pews, I don't think that they all really noticed, or it wasn't a jarring change for them. And I think that's in part because of what Dan was saying earlier. This is a fairly conservative update of the 79 service. So it's familiar to people. The wording is similar to the prayer book. It follows the traditional language that people are used to. So it wasn't really a big change for people. And our music director was very supportive of it. We talked about it at staff meeting, and I don't think it impacted his musical choices very much.
What, Kate, what about like other people in the liturgy, like acolytes or other liturgical ministers? Was there special instruction you had to give to them?
No, because we just did the solemn collects. We do the standing, sitting, kneeling, sorry, as is traditional, and we just did it the exact same way. So there wasn't too much change. I will say, I remember some comments afterwards, people saying, well, we're praying for the Jewish people, we're acknowledging the Jewish people. What about other religions? Shouldn't we pray for all religions? And so that kind of opened up an interesting conversation about, Christianity's special relationship to Judaism, that, reminding people Jesus was Jewish. So we have a different relationship with Judaism than we might with other faiths.
Well, thank you, Kate. I'm glad it went well in your parish. I know I've had instances where some people, you change something and they don't know that it happened. So
Yeah.
I'm glad you had that context.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say like probably half the parish did notice, right? So
Yeah.
some people notice, other people don't notice.
Yeah, I want to add something here that Kate said at the beginning, which is there's Jewish congregants. And I think it's a really important, or congregants who have Jewish connections. So I think it's a really important pastoral note. And all the various congregations I've been part of, I either know people who um, are married to someone who's Jewish, have a close family member who's Jewish, um, are themselves from Jewish heritage, or in other ways have close relationship with Jewish people. And I think it's important to realize that in worship, um, when we are there, the people who are in our lives are also present with us in some way. And so I think I think this liturgy isn't just about changing words to make sure we get things right, but it's also about this kind of wider web of relationships that we're always bringing to liturgy.
Mm. And another thing I had thought of was that I've known friends who are Jewish who are staff singers in Episcopal churches. And well, I haven't talked to them directly about this. That brings to mind uh, their feelings, how they feel.
That's true here too.
Mm. Well, thank you both. I'd like to ask Richard next about some of the musical implications of this liturgy. I know in my parish, Richard and I are both Ohio born, and in my parish in Christ Church in Hudson, Ohio, we kind of have a set uh, way that we do stuff. I have music that I set aside, and we have a formula we do. So, Richard, how does this change that? A lot, small?
Not much. So if you're a lot of what you're already doing, I think if you're using touches on things including anti-Semitism in hymns comes out in a few years to get more on that. I mean, a lot of what you're doing is already really good. I would say the most important thing you can do is to be thoughtful, prayerful, and careful about the music that you select. Make sure, read it over. People to hear or that you think may be anti-Semitic. It's always, I think, better to err on the side of caution in these situations. In particular, musically, the most there is a note and it's an important note, and it basically says, do not use the improperia or the reproaches.
Richard, you're breaking up on my end. Dan and Kate, are you having that as well?
Yes,
Alternative reproaches.
yeah. Richard, you broke up a little bit.
Oh no. Hell.
Um,
I was worried about that, but what can we do? So
can you just go back and recap the reproaches?
yeah.
Okay.
So the reproaches, they're on page 5 of the liturgy where we say don't use them. Also wouldn't schedule them. There are modern reproaches that are in the Anglican Church of Canada's Book of Alternative Services. They're in the South Africa Anglican Prayer Book 1989. If anybody has connections with the Sanders estate and would like to see if we can get permission to amend those, please, I would love to be involved with that. And there are similarly very good lamentory pieces that you can use. Thinking of selections from Lamentations like O Vos Omnes, just some gorgeous stuff. Also, I do have, if people are Historia Populae Meus in English, following the tradition, done at Christ Church in New Haven, that I wrote for a friend and for her choir in Tennessee. Outside of that, I will never not take an opportunity to plug episcopalchant.com, which is a website that I run with my friend Arlie Coles. Hosts lots of cool Episcopal chant stuff. You should check it out. But it includes versions of the Passion. Ours on the site is amended with the Judeans in place of the Jews. And we will have the solemn collects that Dan has written in this liturgy updated by hopefully the end of this week or the beginning of next for you to use in chant if that is part of your tradition in your parish. Speaking as somebody who comes from that tradition myself, I find that very important.
Apologies, Richard, if you had said this when you were broken up, but I just want to check and maybe get everyone's thoughts on this as well, is just let's say there's a musical setting that's polyphonic of the Passion. It sounds like from what you've said about changing some of the wording in the Passion that it's just key words here and there, like in a polyphonic setting, rather than having to like redo a whole section. Would I be right in that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would think so. You know, I would say, like, I was at a Good Friday service once that was this sort of polyphonic chant where the Jews was so beautifully chanted over and over again that I felt was such a disconnect between like the aesthetic and the beauty and the really problematic sort of scapegoating that I felt was happening in the text. And so if you could find ways to change it to even just a word like them or the people, it doesn't always have to be the Judeans, even, especially I think once you're into chant, I think there's a little bit more of a flexibility with emendation as well.
Yeah.
And just to underscore what Richard was saying, it's like the issue with the improperia, the reproaches, is that it's the voice of God scolding Israel for not being faithful. And sort of, and it has in its classic form saying, basically, I sent you my son and you killed him. So what's doing is it's reiterating this old thing called the deicide charge, that Jews are Christ killers. In that moment, it's supposed to be the church taking on the role of Israel. But once we leave church, we're no longer kind of the Jewish people in that moment. And so, as Richard alluded to, there's been some really good updated versions of the improperia that move it into the voice of the church being addressed instead of the voice of Israel or the Jewish people.
And my contact information is available on episcopalchant.com. I do have for my own private use and sort of what I like in the updated one, which I will say is used by the ELCA and the Presbyterians and the Methodists. So it's all very common.
I'll also plug that just something we've used a lot is if you want to chant the Good Friday anthems at the end, there's a fabulous setting by Russell Schultz Widmar that calls for SATB choir and solo cello. And it's just heart-wrenchingly beautiful. And so it's published by GIA, and if you don't know it, get a copy. We do it every year, and it got to a point when we first did it, the choir said, we better do this every year. So I like to keep my job, so I say, sure, let's do it. Well, why don't we get to some questions that have been submitted, if that's okay with y'all.
Mm-hmm.
one of them here is we all kind of hit on this particularly, but someone is asking about bishop's permission to use it. How do you go about doing that? Maybe Kate, since you had to do it in your parish, how did you go about contacting your bishop?
Yeah, just I guess a quick question for Dan and Richard, though. Now that this has just this summer been approved by General Convention, do people still need bishop's permission? Because we used it before that.
Yeah, my understanding is yes, because it's falling into the trial use category. So I think it's possible for a bishop to give blanket permission for the diocese, but that has to be disseminated. Is that your understanding, Richard?
Yeah. Yes. It's a specific Article 10 thing.
Yeah, so we just emailed him and with an explanation, and at that time this had been proposed to General Convention but hadn't been voted on yet. So we'll just say, this is something that is going forward in the in that process. And again, we had Dan, so Dan wrote a sort of explanation of why, and the bishop was only too happy to say yes and thought it was a really good idea. And in fact, then of course asked Dan to lead a whole clergy day about it later on, which he did. He very kindly did. So yeah, so it wasn't hard to get permission, but I always, I think it's always the best practice whenever changing anything. Sometimes you feel like you're peppering the bishop with little questions or whatever, but it's better to have like the record of the email that you did ask. And they can ignore you or say yes or whatever they want to do. But I think if bishops don't know what parishes are doing, then they don't know how to shape their guidance, right? They need to know that parishes are finding certain things problematic or what's going on. So I think that the communicating is important.
Your bishop also probably voted for it at General Convention because it did pass overwhelmingly.
Yeah. I'll just add this. I spoke to a number of bishops over my period of time of doing this revision process, and to a person, they all said, "Thank you. This liturgy has always bothered me," or "This Passion Gospel has always bothered me," or one bishop said, "Yeah, I always change it to Judeans on the fly when I'm reading it on Good Friday." And so there were so many things happening in the breach that it was good to actually bring in a formal process of developing something that was coherent.
Thank you all. Another question we have is just regarding inclusion of Sarah and Hagar. They're asking about the authenticity of it to prayer in the Jewish tradition.
Right. So let me try to address this. Hagar generally isn't invoked in liturgical prayer in the Jewish tradition. In some Reform movement Jewish synagogues, you often will find invocation of both the patriarchs and matriarchs in Jewish prayer, Abraham and Sarah, as you kind of move along towards higher degrees of traditional observance and worship into the conservative movement and then to the various Orthodox movements. You'll find less and less of that variation. But Hagar really kind of sits outside of that for the reasons Richard mentioned.
Someone else is asking about it seems like some copyright issues and discussing merits of substituting the term Judeans in the Passion. I'm thinking maybe are there any copyright issues with changing stuff?
So, to my recollection, what had happened was that somebody had raised the point in 2022 when Dan and I first proposed this to General Convention that it was a copyright issue with amending the NRSV. And I really can't say much more than that.
Yeah, so let me just try to address the big picture idea was maybe somehow this would be a liturgy that was unique insofar as a a biblical passage would be part of the printed out version would be part of the liturgical materials. Like there would be a passion gospel that would be part of the rite, like as an appendix. And because the team I was working with mostly was working off of the NRSV, we did a few slight tweaks. One was to change it from the Jews to the Judeans. Again, to underline what Richard said before, those are both equally literal translations of the same Greek word. But because the base text was NRSV, that was deemed to be a copyright issue. And we have almost 20 biblical translations approved for use in the Episcopal Church. Maybe it's more like a dozen. But if you go into the canons of the Episcopal Church in Title II, I believe it's the second article maybe, lays out all of the approved English language translations. Some of those, like the Common English Bible and the Contemporary English Version, and SCLM here lists the NIV as well, all do a dynamic equivalent translations that when it says the Jews, sometimes they change it to other words like the leaders, the Jewish leaders, they, the people. I will just observe there's nothing that prevents someone in a parish from just deciding to change it from Jews to Judeans. It was really an issue of the Episcopal Church as a body endorsing and circulating a changed text under which it did not have copyright control. And I'll acknowledge that's a fine legal line, but if someone's reading something that's not printed, that's much different. Or if you're talking, Mario, about you already have a polyphonic chant and you're looking at changing words, and again, that's a different dynamic, I think, than the Episcopal Church circulating something.
Right.
And Richard, hopefully I didn't say anything that you don't think is true canonically
No,
there.
I think that's entirely canonically accurate.
Well, this, Richard, the question goes for you about episcopalchant.com, if it is NRSV text with slight modifications, and asking about other authorized translations that have been pointed that you're aware of.
Yeah, it is the NRSV text with
Are you still there, Richard?
there we go. It's NRSV with Judean slotted in.
Well, friends, I think I'm gonna call this the last question. There was just a question about updated reproaches found in the Anglican provinces of Canada and Southern. And I think, Richard, you'd already discussed that a little bit. Does anyone have anything else to say about that
Yeah,
one?
this is Walter Brownrich. Hi, Walter. It's interesting. I don't think you actually need the bishop's permission to use the reproaches. It's not actually listed in the prayer book. You can use it as another suitable option, I believe. So yes, I think these updated reproaches that are put. I think the key here is putting it that making sure the addressee is the church and not the Jewish people. I think it's like the really significant element here, and I think the Church of Canada does that. I also think the good in common worship, I believe Anthem 1 is also from the Church of England is also a good option for this as well.
And the UMC and the PCUSA have the updated reproaches in their recent.
Sorry, Richard, you broke up in that last sentence. Well, friends, I think that will be the end of our webinar. I want to thank all of you so much for your expertise, for being here, giving your time and talents, and also giving this great gift to the church. So thank you, and thank everyone for tuning in today. I hope you got some good insight into this, and I hope you all have a great rest of Epiphany and into Lent.
Well, thank you very much to Mario and Patrick and everyone else.
Thank you.